Hello. So today I'm here with my friend, and we are both going to be talking about what it's like for other minds, the philosophy behind it. And like my other posts, I am going to try and focus this on a personal philosophy slash their own psychology of how they think about these certain topics. Yeah, the biggest topic today we're going to be talking about is what it's like to think about others' minds. Um, and I showed you that article a little bit, like you skimmed it. I mean, you get the general gist of it all, right?
Right, yeah, I understand.
Yeah. The article that I'm talking about is the one by Godfrey-Smith, on being an octopus. Did you have any general thoughts just before we get into it about this topic?
Um, I just had a second to look over it real quick.
Yeah, I'm just saying like anything, like.
I certainly found it interesting the idea of sort of blending the different areas of consciousness, like how we kind of see everything separately, with like taste and smell and all that. And it sounds like with the octopus, they kind of blend it all together, and I found that interesting.
Yeah, I definitely think that's an interesting topic as well. I mean, hey, that's why I picked it, right? so, but yeah, so like what you perceive as like, a color, let's say like blue, like your perception of blue can be drastically different of my perception of blue, and we would never know, I mean, other than the fact that blue in some way is like the same for everybody, it's just that we perceive it differently. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah, and I definitely think that that's interesting, because that can be the case for a lot of things. I mean, like the way we hear things can be different. Um, you know, how we feel can be completely different. How we think. We've talked about these things before, but yeah. Any thoughts on that specifically?
Um, well, it's interesting because I remember hearing about this one guy who had some sort of dysfunction in his brain where he couldn't it was like he couldn't see colors or something, um but they attached like this antenna to his head where he could actually taste colors,
He
something
could
like that. I'm
taste
not
colors. I've never
Yeah,
heard of that.
it was like the way that his brain processed the wavelengths or something.
So he couldn't perceive colors, but they made it so he could taste it. That was
Yeah, it was like something like that, like where his vision was changed sort of to another sense.
okay. So it's sort of like how a blind person, their other like their hearing gets better because they have to focus more on that, like that sort of thing. Is what you're saying.
Sort of, I guess, but I think it's more like translating it into a whole different sense.
I think
So like,
that's definitely if that's what it is. That's definitely some major technology because we're translating an entire sense, like an entire um, fraction of how we perceive everything into something else. I think that's definitely wild. I'll have to look that up
right.
after this. Um, I
But yeah,
mean,
I mean the idea that like a human could also have that ability, it's just like, it's all about, I guess, how you evolve to meet your surroundings.
yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think that my biggest take. I'm gonna get to my biggest take, but this is the lead up to it. Um, I think what's important here is not exactly the exact instances of perception. Like to go back to the color thing, like I don't think it really matters if your blue is different from my blue, as long as there is that consistent what blue is outside of our perception. I think that's the biggest thing. And for evolution, I think that as humans at least, that we understand like I understand that I can't think exactly how you're thinking or exactly what you're thinking or anything like that. And same thing if I were to apply that with, my cat or um, the birds outside on the tree next to my window. Like I understand that. So the I use empathy to inject myself into this these other worlds that I can't comprehend, but I'm
Hmm.
able to understand it on my level. Like I'm breaking down things into a way that I can personally understand. And I think that's the most important thing in this topic. Like empathy is the most important thing. What would you say to
Hmm.
that? Did all that make
Yeah,
sense, by the way?
no, that definitely makes sense. I think at that point you have to think about, well, how much is everything sort of a spectrum to less intelligent to more intelligent? So I remember skimming over and seeing that they were comparing like an octopus to a dog and that they have only slightly more neurons. So like is experience directly relative to like how many neurons you have?
Hmm.
Or are there brains that are totally different? Like can you sort of scale down your understanding of reality to understand like an animal, or is their experience entirely different?
Yeah. And I think in the beginning there you're looking at it in more of a scientific way, and I completely respect that. It's just I can't really broach that, like I don't think either of us have the qualifications to, talk about neurons and if they matter or whatnot.
Right.
So, I would like to keep it to that second part you were sort of talking about with the breaking down, because like with a lot of things, with humans, I think I've talked about this before, in one of my other videos, but yeah, I like a lot of things. Like with a lot of things, humans need to break down their surroundings on a way that we can understand them. Like mathematics is objectively like not real. It's a human way of breaking down the things around us so we can understand them. And I think that's the same way with empathy, where like we don't truly know the universe, but we use that math to translate it enough so we can understand it. And like I'm making that comparison with empathy. And that's like I said, like I think that's the biggest thing to understand. I mean, what do you think would be the biggest thing to understand other beings?
Um, well, I think you nailed it with empathy. I mean, like we've kind of, as different as everybody is and as different as all cultures are, like we all always kind of end up at the same moral code, um, with only slight variation. Uh, so yeah, just kind of breaking it down and thinking about what's important to you and how you want other people to treat you, and just kind of apply that to the values of other creatures.
Yeah, like I said before, injecting ourselves into these other beings. So, what would you say? How do I say this? I'm sorry. I'm just trying to think of the best way to say this. Well, while I'm trying to think of that, I don't want to take up too much time just doing nothing. So, would you say that you would have agreed? Would you have arrived to the conclusion of empathy if I didn't say that? Like, what would be your first instinct if I weren't saying what I think the answer is?
You mean in terms of
How we can
like,
understand other beings without, you know, being the other beings.
um, I don't know if I would have come to a different answer. I don't think I would have.
Okay. Well, I lost what I was gonna say before. So, um, how do you think we can understand plants then?
I
Like,
mean, the only similarity that I can think of in terms of plants is like self-preservation, but I don't.
yeah, I mean, I was going to say I would understand it on a biological level. Like, they need to pollinate, they need to procreate, they need to get the sun, they need to use photosynthesis to survive, to make more plants, so on. That's how I would approach that topic as well.
Right.
Um, I'm really annoyed that I can't think of what I was saying before. Um, it's okay. I think this is a good place to wrap up for now. Is there any sort of closing things that you want to say or talk about? I mean, maybe we could talk some more if you can think of some other things.
Um, okay. I guess, can you relate to an animal or a creature that doesn't have sort of its own consciousness, like something that just sort of acts on instinct? Like,
So,
is
like a
there
jellyfish.
any, sure, like, is there any basis of similarity?
Well, again, I would say if it doesn't really have a consciousness, or at least a consciousness that we can understand. Like, I mean, I'm sure in some way that a plant has consciousness, like it is a living thing. I would argue that, any living thing has a consciousness of some kind, just, we can't really break that down, at least technologically right now. I mean, maybe in 100 years we'll be able to understand what plants are thinking, but, you know,
Hmm.
I would argue that everything has a consciousness, and I would say for the things with consciousness that we perceive as like having nothing, like I said, like jellyfish or plants or anything, I would again go back to a biological impulse of needing to do things and instincts. And I mean, that brings up a whole nother topic in itself because, like what are instincts? Like, how do we, how are these things like passed down and whatnot? Like, that's a whole nother
Right.
topic. Like, I don't even know where to start with that.
But you would say consciousness is entirely on a spectrum sort of scale.
Yeah, I would
Like everything
definitely
has
say.
it to some extent. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from what we know, I mean, obviously it's um, what's the word? It's I can't think of the word. Bias. There you go. Bias. Obviously, it's biased to say, but I would say that our consciousness is the most complex out of any other creature out there. We would be on the right side of the spectrum, and then like plants and jellyfish and things that mostly act on not impulse but instinct and biological needs would be on like the complete other side. And then you have things like dolphins that are closer to us. Then you have things like, I don't know, bugs that are closer to the left with less conscious. I would
Hmm.
definitely agree with that. There's a spectrum of it.
Sure.
I mean, what would you say? You have anything to add to that?
Um, yeah, no, I would definitely agree. It's definitely harder to see it towards the left end, as you would say.
Yeah,
But you can definitely see the signs of it with the smarter animals.
yeah.
How their consciousness isn't so much as a sudden thing that happens with humans. You can see the subtle signs of it.
Would you argue that like what I was saying before, would you argue that anything that's living would have a consciousness of some kind?
I would say yes. Obviously, we can't know that for sure,
Hmm.
but from what I can observe, I would say yes.
Yeah, because I'm not saying a consciousness that rivals ours or anything, but you know what I'm saying, where it's like of some kind, there's some sort of thought,
Right, there's something happening, yeah.
I mean, it's also weird to think about, like, I would think about this as a kid, like, how does the cat know, like what it wants or like where to go or whatever when it doesn't know how to talk? Like, that inside voice we all have in our heads, like I know we talked about this a bit, in our personal discussions, that we kind of constantly think of things and, like at night we're always thinking about stuff, so it's like hard to sleep or whatever. I know, people vary on that, like how much they have that inner monologue. But yeah, I mean, what would be your thoughts on like things that don't can't use language to express themselves? Like, how do you think their minds work? Like,
Well,
let's say a cat needs to eat. Like, how does it tell itself that to go get the food over, at the other side of the kitchen or whatever?
well, as far as I know, it's sort of pure impulse. I don't know that for a fact, but I believe humans are the only ones who can sort of speak in their own sort of created language rather than sort of like a body language, um, in terms of telling them to do something. Because when we're hungry or something, we still have that impulse,
Yeah,
but then on top of that, we bring in sort of putting it into our own language that we created
yeah,
to sort of tell us to do that as well, which is like a totally different thing.
yeah. Cause like personally, Um, if I'm hungry, I'm gonna think in my head, I'm hungry. Like, and then, maybe go through what I have in the refrigerator or whatever, So, like, I don't think I could turn off that monologue. Do you
Right.
think you could do that? Like, have you ever just had an impulse without using language to describe it to yourself or like, you know what I'm saying, right?
Well, I think that happens constantly. I mean, for like something simple like bodily movements, if you suddenly have an itch or something, you might twitch or something like that, which is
Hmm.
completely outside of your consciousness.
That is true. Unless you have that second to think about it, like if it's just like something that happens, like you're not gonna think. Like if somebody throws a ball at you and says heads up, and you look and you duck, you're not thinking about that. Does make sense
Yeah, you don't say to yourself, "I'm gonna duck now."
because
You
that
just have the impulse.
that is weird to think about. Because like I said, like in my own perception, like I do have to talk to myself, but like I didn't really think about those impulses. I mean, that's such a weird way to navigate the world. Like, could you imagine like just running on that?
Right.
I find that hard to imagine.
Yeah, it is. It's hard to believe. There are
Like,
probably some humans that do it.
I mean, there probably are. There's probably some. I mean, not saying that this is, the end all be all of scientific, whatever, but like I saw a Reddit post, saying that this guy lived his entire life without thinking through language and he just discovered it and like it completely like changed his life and he was like dumbfounded. Like it
Hmm.
was just like it was like discovering another sense, It's like, oh my god, like I can
Yeah.
do this stuff. Like I really can't imagine that. Like
Well,
how would I,
that's another question. Can you process your own thoughts without having a created language, like just with your brain? But it's like we can't even conceive of not having a language.
yeah, and I mean our ancestors had to have done that. But I think since we're such social creatures, I mean saying humans, since we're such social creatures, like we need that language in order to communicate with the other people in our tribe or cave or whatever. So we've had to adapt to becoming more and more able to uh, inter interconnect ourselves and inter like utilize the world together.
Hmm.
So I think we've most people at least, I would assume, would find that hard to do. But like I said, it's definitely something that we would have had to have done, as like proto monkeys, or I don't know if proto is the right word, but um, proto humans is the right way to say it. You
Right.
know, that's what I meant to say. But like slightly elevated monkeys, we'd have to have done that. But at the same time, animals do have their own languages, and I mean even plants have their own languages because animals bark or you know uh, not to say that it takes over like body language as you were saying, but dogs bark or growl and cats hiss and monkeys coo, like ooh, and birds chirp for mates and stuff like that, and plants send like pheromones or whatever. I don't know exactly.
Yes.
I'm
Yeah.
not a biologist, but like they have their own sort of languages, so they also do it in some way. I just don't think, because I don't know, because I'm trying to think of other group animals or beings that like need to survive. Because like when you break it down, hmm, I'm just trying to think
What do
of
you mean, like other like pack animals?
I'm trying to think of how much language is needed to evolve like other species. Like to go back to before with the humans, like my hypothesis was that we needed these social abilities to get better. But maybe humans, I would say humans are the outlier of like every other animal. So maybe that's not a good way of putting it. But it's a good way of putting it, I think, for humans at least. Because I was trying to apply that to other animals, you know?
I kind of got lost, like developing a more complex language.
Yeah, I'm saying like, I was wondering about the necessity of basically having to get a more complicated language. I was trying to apply that to other animals.
Hmm.
Because, like I said, my hypothesis was that humans needed to do that because we're very social creatures. So I was
I
trying to
mean,
think of like other
although
animals.
at the same time, monkeys are also very social, but
Yeah.
they've survived all this time without evolving further.
That I mean, you also have to think though, like we've trained monkeys and apes to do sign language.
Hmm.
So they do have that capacity of human language. I mean, it might be
Right.
rudimentary compared to, me and you talking right now, but it's still quite a
So
feat.
yeah, so they have the capacity, but it hasn't actually happened, which I guess would indicate that it's not necessary for their survival.
No.
Otherwise, they would most likely acquire it.
Cuz like it's really hard to think about like why we needed that language. Hmm.
Right, because why would we have developed it if we didn't need it? So yeah, what would have caused us to need it?
Well, I mean, this might be straying off topic a bit, but I think we have this need to be able to manipulate the world around us, and I think language plays a part in needing to have the ability to try and manipulate the people around us, whether for good or
Hmm.
bad or whatever.
Hmm.
Like how we manipulate the world to, these like metal and flint and all we manipulate everything around us to create these ridiculous things. But to go back to the topic a bit, I think we needed the language to also express that empathy, like express ourselves to other people so they can understand us better.
Hmm.
Because again, I think we inherently know that we don't know exactly what other beings are thinking or feeling or whatever. So we try and apply
Right. So
that.
because our minds have progressed so far above other animals, we have so much more basically to say to each other and to feel towards each other that the language could have just evolved simply from that.
Yeah. So I think that's a good way to end it. We've been talking a while. I appreciate you talking to me. Is there anything you want to say real quick or anything like that?
Oh, not that I can think of.
All right. Well, um, I'll see you.
All right. Thanks for having me on.
All right.